Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's Mr. Merlo here again. I figured we'd take the next couple of days, weeks, whatever it might be, and maybe kind of review ourselves on different cycles of nature. The one I want to do today is the water cycle. So let's start out by looking at some terminology along with the water cycle. Evaporation, that's where water is turned into a vapor. Transpiration, that's where plants such as trees and things like that release water through their leaves. Condensation is when water vapor cools and forms little droplets. Precipitation is, of course, when water falls from the sky. Runoff is when we have water going from a high location to a low location. Infiltration is when water is absorbed into the earth. And collection points, or collection as I have listed here, is just where water flows to a point and then it just kind of stays there until the cycle starts again. And that can be things like an ocean or a pond or things of that nature. So let's take a look at the water cycle. Start off with the driving force behind the water cycle is heat energy. That's energy that comes from the sun, and it adds energy to molecules of water. When these molecules of water become energized, they start to, for lack of a better way to phrase it, they evaporate or they start to float up into the air. So the sun is the whole driving force behind the water cycle. It's the reason that we have rain, snow, things like that. The sun is really the driving force for everything on the earth. So when the sun gives energy to the water, it causes it to evaporate. And this is where water droplets, or water molecules, I should say, float up into the air. Transpiration is when trees or other plants, things like that, actually give off water vapor through their leaves. Now, I doubt you've learned much about that in science, and I don't want to go too in-depth in it, with our situation being you guys at home, but basically what happens is, in the leaves of plants, there are tiny little holes where water gets released. Think of a tree or a plant kind of like a straw. When you're drinking through a straw, for you to be able to take water up through the bottom and get it to, you have to suck on it to get water to come out the top. Well, plants need to be able to get water from their roots all the way to the tips of the leaves of their trees. And the way they're able to do this is they have these little tiny holes in the leaves. They're called stoma, and they allow water vapor or water to escape through these little holes. And as it escapes out the top of these plants, more water is able to be drawn in through the roots and up through the tree, bringing, nutrients and things like that from the soil with it. So basically, a tree or a plant acts kind of like a great big straw. It sucks up water with nutrients in it, and it delivers those nutrients where it needs to go in the plant. And then the excess water, it can't, get rid of it like we do by peeing or urinating. It lets it out through the top, through its leaves. But that process is called transpiration. And as it releases that water into the air, it's kind of similar to evaporation where, it's just water molecules floating around in the air. When water molecules get up high enough, they start to cool off. Now, under normal conditions, water molecules don't stick that well together. But due to the fact that we have a lot of dust and debris that floats around in their air at all times, these little water molecules will start to stick to or condense onto little droplets of dust and things like that. And as that happens, once you start getting water droplets sticking to that dust, then they all start to kind of cling together. And eventually we start to form clouds that we're familiar with. And basically all a cloud is just a big mist of water, just tiny little water droplets, so to speak, that are starting to stick together. Now, as time goes by and more water starts to stick to each other, those little droplets become heavier and heavier and heavier. And eventually, when the water's cool enough and we have enough stuck together, they'll start to fall out of the sky. We call that precipitation. And I feel confident you guys are probably familiar with at least precipitation part of this. And that's where you have rain, sleet, snow, or hail. The water literally just falls out of the sky in some form. From there, we're going to move on to something called runoff. Now, living in the mountains, we're familiar with runoff. When it rains, what happens is water wants to go from high elevations to lower elevations. And that's simply just gravity pulling it down, is all it is. And in the process of doing that, it forms little creeks and streams and springs and things like that that we're familiar with seeing, as when we go through the woods or just around our towns and neighborhoods and stuff. But what ends up happening is, as it rains and water settles in higher locations, it slowly works its way down off of the higher elevations to the lower elevations. And we call that runoff. Most of our creeks and streams, if you look at them, you can kind of see how they're slowly flowing in one direction. Well, the direction they're flowing in is actually downhill. Now, it may not look downhill to you, but it's actually flowing downhill, and it'll eventually reach all the way to other like rivers and streams and things like that. We'll empty into bigger rivers, lakes, and streams. And for us here in West Virginia, air water eventually works its way into the Mississippi, and then it eventually gets all the way down to its back to sea level at the Gulf of Mexico. From there, we have something called infiltration. So not all the water runs off in the way that we think of, as rivers and streams. Some of it actually gets absorbed into the ground. And when it does that, we call that process infiltration, and it forms what we call groundwater. Many of us here in West Virginia have what we call wells, or we use well water at our house. That's where this water comes from. It comes from water that gets absorbed into the ground, and it finds tiny little pockets that it can form underground. Sometimes those pockets are huge, and they can form little creeks or streams, and it flows in and out of rocks, especially like limestone and things like that. It can kind of work its way through. But that's groundwater, and when we tap into like wells, that's what we're actually doing, is we're tapping into that water and pulling it back up to the surface for us to use. And then, of course, we have what we call collection points. This is where the water goes to stay for a while. Oftentimes it stays there until the water cycle starts over again. So with groundwater, usually once water gets into the ground, it kind of stays there unless it comes out as a spring or we pump it back out or something like that. And of course, little places like ponds and things like that, water will collect there and stay there, rivers and oceans as well. And it'll stay there until the water cycle starts over. So this is just kind of a quick and easy version of the water cycle. Hopefully most of this has been reviewed for you.